As I said, the topic is late payment in the construction industry. The part I'm going to cover is going to touch a little bit on the introduction of blockchain and digital currencies. And Kregg is going to talk about the pain of the late payments as well as what we see potentially as a solution. And Q&A, you will have an opportunity to ask perhaps more technical questions. Before we start, I wanted to ask you guys, how many of you, have heard of Bitcoin? If you raise the hands, pretty much everyone, right? What about Ethereum? Have you heard of Ethereum? Pretty much everyone. Blockchain technology. Okay, so amazing. We have a very sophisticated audience, and I think that's great. I'm going to try to keep it at a high level, but we'll start with a little bit of a context because people often ask, Bitcoin is in a bubble and it's going to burst. What's going to happen next? And I think that it's helpful to look at the technology in a larger context. In September 2008, probably most of you have seen or watched that event unfolding. Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy. Interestingly enough, actually, prior to that, there are already researchers and scientists with the invention of internet wondering whether the currency could be also digitized because that would allow corporates to start transacting online as well. In November 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto publishes a paper called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. In 2009, in early 2009, the Bitcoin network is born. In late 2013, one of our homegrown Vitalik Buterin, a dropout from Waterloo University, effectively generalizes the Bitcoin technology and publishes his white paper on Ethereum. And in August 2014, Ethereum actually becomes the largest crowdsourcing project, raising $18.4 million in the first, decentralized crowdfunding campaign. You can probably also call it the first ICO that there has ever been. In November 2017, just 3 years later, Bitcoin market cap is $150 billion, and Ethereum market cap is $44 billion. Since you are quite aware of the technology, you know that Bitcoin yesterday crossed an important milestone, $10,000 US. I checked the news today. It's already over $11,000. So obviously, something is going on, and this context is to provide a larger view to say that the evolution of a digital currency in some way is inevitable. Whether Bitcoin is going to be the one that's going to dominate or not, I think that's less relevant. But we need a digital currency at the time of internet. So what is Bitcoin? So first of all, Bitcoin is a decentralized network of computers that are run globally. And the map just sort of shows you where most of the computers are being run today. So as you see, heavily dominated by North America as well as Europe. But you can see the dots pretty much everywhere. What's interesting is that these computers are all reachable and they provide certain services. One of the services is validation of the transactions. One actually type of clients that I'm missing here are digital wallets. So anyone who wanted to buy a Bitcoin, you know that you need to install a digital wallet, whether on your computer or on your mobile device. And the digital wallet effectively connects you to this network of Bitcoin nodes. You can then send a transaction to your friend or a crypto exchange if you want to. And the transaction then is distributed to all the computers. The other important function in this network of nodes is a mining or securing the transactions, right? So what is interesting about Bitcoin is that all the transactions that get validated are at the end stored on a blockchain, on a public blockchain. which is really just a database of a series of transactions. But what's interesting about this database that it's sequential and the information is effectively linked together through cryptography. And that function is effectively satisfied by nodes that specialize in something called mining. The other important thing to know about the blockchain technology, which makes it very interesting, is that all of these, not all of these computer nodes, but many of these computer nodes effectively store an exact replica of these blockchain transactions, which makes it very difficult to hijack for any entity. And that's really what makes the blockchain and Bitcoin a very interesting technology and effectively global decentralized cryptocurrency. Now, besides Bitcoin, we now have many other coins, and that's sort of another interesting element of cryptocurrency is that it's open source. And as an open source, anyone can effectively take the code and create their own project. Fortunately, it's not as simple as that, because just because you clone the code doesn't mean that you get the miners to support your transactions. And also, you don't necessarily get the community to actually start using your network. But some of these coins that I have included here are the largest coins today. So Bitcoin Cash, as of recently, is actually a fork of Bitcoin. This has been a result of ongoing contentious debate about scaling. And I guess the resolution has been that the group that believes that Bitcoin is a digital cash and the transaction fees needs to stay low. They have decided that they will fork of the Bitcoin network and create their own. Today, Bitcoin Cash's market capitalization is $27 billion. And in fact, I believe it's now competing with Ethereum for number 2 position. But there are also some older coins, like Litecoin, for example, that is specializing in fast transactions, or Dash, specifically focused on privacy. Now, Bitcoin itself is not necessarily a public record of transactions, but I believe it's called pseudo-anonymous in the sense that there are no names that are stored who did transactions with whom. Everyone is represented through effectively private keys. However, by following the blockchain, you could effectively trace it back to a crypto exchange or many of these transactions where you would be able to associate the particular account number with the person's name. And that, of course, is of concern, especially to the community that cares about privacy. And that's where some of these private-focused coins have sort of popped in and started to provide a solution that would basically make it impossible to identify who did transactions. Now, besides coin, as I said, Vitalik Buterin have initially started an interesting project called Ethereum. The initial scope was just simply to generalize Bitcoin so that people can create their own blockchains and can create their own coins that have sort of fairly quickly increased in scope. And Gavin Wood, which was one of the co-founders on Ethereum, have actually famously then called Ethereum as the first decentralized global computer. What is unique about Ethereum? What is unique about Ethereum compared to Bitcoin is that people can issue their own custom tokens. So, Arkilio could, for example, create Arkilio Token if someone was interested. Even of more interest is the fact that on Ethereum network, the token can be controlled programmatically. And that technology was given a name called smart contract. What it really does is it allows you to deploy a contract between multiple parties onto the blockchain, where the contract is effectively protected through cryptography. And it's the program itself that guarantees the execution of the agreement between the parties. And the other thing which is also, I guess, different from Bitcoin is that in order to run your smart contracts on Ethereum network, you have to pay for the computation. So that's where sort of the concept of gas comes in, and the price of gas is expressed in Ether. Now, Ethereum is not the only blockchain technology. There are others that have popped up as well. You may know or have heard or read in the news that with some of the ICOs, there have been issues with performance of the Ethereum network, and there are concerns about scalability and potentially other concerns. So other groups have come in and decided to create their own project where they try to solve some of these problems. So well known, for example, is Rootstock, that is trying to bring the power of smart contracts to Bitcoin network. Interestingly enough, they have decided to actually take advantage of the Solidity language that Ethereum is using to implement smart contracts. EOS, that has a well-documented focus on scalability and reliability of running smart contracts. Hyperledger, which is sort of IBM-sponsored project, which is focusing on permissioned blockchains. Corda.net, focusing on privacy. ICOs. So that's actually one of the very interesting and also talked about issue lately with Ethereum and the ability for anyone to issue their own token and effectively now reach out the global network of people or owners of Bitcoin or Ether. We suddenly had means for people to bootstrap and fund their projects. And that's really where the ICO concept came in. It's called initial coin offering. And what it does is, today if Arkilio decided that we would like to raise some funds to help us develop the platform, we would write a technical white paper that describe what we are trying to do, how do we intend to the technology to work, and then we would issue our own token, and we would pre-sell that token, tapping into the network of all the users globally that potentially are sitting on some Bitcoins. They would contribute their Bitcoin, and in exchange for their Bitcoin, we would issue and give them Arkilio token that presumably without a couple months of the ICO would be traded on a crypto exchange, so they could now potentially sell Arkilio token, hopefully for profit, right? So that's sort of an interesting phenomenon that Ethereum have unlocked. And as you can see from that graph, the results have been incredible. So ICO market in 2017, and these numbers are actually old, you see that it goes until June, have reached $327 million raised. So this was for the first 6 months of 2017, and that amount have actually exceeded the amount of money raised via traditional means like VCs. So quite amazing. Now, some of the regulators stepped in and started to be concerned that the ICOs effectively represent a offer of unregistered security. It is very much a significant regulatory risk that still exists with ICOs. It's going to be perhaps 2018 that is going to become famous and comes into the books as the year when the regulators stepped in, and some lawsuits are going to start being pursued by the government. And we will probably also start hearing a little bit more about which projects might satisfy the security profile and which may be actually genuinely considered as crowdfunding. Now, some of the challenges of the technology, so I already said in my description of some of these competing projects that one important challenge is scalability. And you can just see if you go back to that original diagram where I showed you what Bitcoin network is. It's effectively a peer-to-peer network of globally distributed computers, and many of those computers have exact replica of the database of transactions that have been accepted. You immediately realize that speed is going to be a problem because the copy of the data has to be constantly propagated between all of these computers. So one of the big challenges today is how can we actually deliver this and at the same time also ensure that the network can deliver speeds that potentially would be required to handle, for example, Visa transaction level. So you see today, Bitcoin can do about 3 transactions per second. Ethereum is a little bit better, maybe about 7 transactions per second. But Visa today is doing 50,000 transactions at sort of the peak capacity. So obviously, the existing blockchain is going to struggle to become the global means of payment that would compete with Visa. So something has to give. The other important issue is transaction costs. So part of this is related to the fact that Bitcoin and Ether continues to appreciate in value compared to fiat currencies. So today, average transaction cost on Bitcoin network is over $6. So obviously, you're not going to use a network like this to pay for your coffee. And this was actually one of the crux of the debate within the Bitcoin community about scaling. So a group of people that believe right now what's most important is that Bitcoin network is secure, that there are no miners that can dominate the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin as a store of value is a sufficient initial proposition, and we will solve the performance later. And the other group believing, no, you won't have time. Look at the share of the market that the Bitcoin has. It's been declining significantly, and one of the reasons is that the transactions fees are too high. And that's really what resulted in splitting of the Bitcoin network into Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin. And of course, another is mining electricity costs. So as I said, miners provide a very important function, which is they help to secure the transactions that have been accepted by the network. Now, it's really by design why you need to make sure that the entity that's securing the transaction is real. And the way that you do it is that you prove that you have done the work. And the way you prove it is that you solve a very computationally challenging problem, and the only one who can answer that problem is who expended the resources to solve it, right? So that allows the network to deal with the fact that someone would be pretending to be solving and contributing when in fact they're not legit. This way that you know that whoever did that, it would be a very expensive proposition because they would have to pay and buy all the expensive hardware. Unfortunately, that comes with the cost. So Bitcoin network today consumes about 30 terawatt hours of electricity. And you can compare that to how much Ireland consumes annually. So obviously, this is a problem that's going to become even more significant. And again, there are sort of debates within the communities how bad that problem is and how it needs to be solved. So Ethereum specifically has a particular view how to solve it. They want to move away from requiring this very expensive computational capacity associated with proof of work, consensus, to something that is called proof of stake. So this is as far as the challenges are concerned. And I will now leave it to Kregg to talk a little bit about Arkilio. Yeah, go ahead.
What's the difference between proof of work and proof of stake?
So proof of stake, not state. Stake, yeah. So the idea is that in proof of stake, the way that you confirm that you're real is that you have to commit effectively a certain amount of cryptocurrency to the network that if you participate in the validation in a way that has been deemed as invalid, the ether that you have contributed would be actually slashed. That's a technical term. In effect, you would lose part of your contribution. So in some way, rather than relying on people that they have done the work, they have invested in an equipment, you're now relying on the people that put at stake, call it their digital dollars, right? If I had, let's say, 10,000 worth of ether, I would put that 10,000 worth of ether on the line, effectively gets locked, and that gives me the right to participate in the consensus. If for some reason I was cheating, part of those $10,000 worth of Ether would be slashed, then I might get back only 5,000 worth of Ether. So this creates a strong incentive against cheating, and it's trying to basically effectively provide the same mechanism that proof of work does. Because if you think of it, proof of work means I have bought the equipment, I spend the electricity costs to solve this difficult problem, and hence you need to trust me. I don't know if I answered your question. Well, they're fundamentally different that in proof of stake, you don't need to buy any hardware and you don't need to spend money on electricity. So it's considered to be environmentally friendly. But there's a lot of debates whether the proof of stake has sort of certain challenges, how it deals with various attack vectors. It's a very lively debate. Yeah, it's kind of at the economic level. Some people disagree that you can secure the network the same way that you can with proof of work algorithm. But Ethereum community definitely is committed to proof of stake. They want to get there sort of slowly over a couple of years.
Does that mean that you end up centralizing it with this proof of stake? Because now you're putting all the emphasis on the people with the most coins.
Yeah, I don't believe that. Their expectation is that it would lead to centralization, because obviously there's a opposite incentive, which is you don't want to commit effectively all your funds. I don't think that the expectation is that there would be 2 or 3 people that would be effectively responsible for providing the consensus mechanism. But to be honest with you, that sort of gets into the technical details that are sort of beyond my pay grade, so to speak. So definitely there are concerns, and Ethereum community believes that these concerns can be dealt with. They are networks that use various combinations of proof of stake or proof of work, and that's actually something that Ethereum is thinking about, how they will migrate from proof of work to proof of stake, that they will initially have some kind of blend of both, effectively moving to proof of stake. So I think that there is valid concern, and I think that ultimately the proof is going to be in the pudding, you know, how well they manage the transition. Yeah, Kregg, go ahead.
So my name's Kregg Fordyce, and I'm not the technical guy up here, that's for sure. I'm actually an architect, and I run a firm called KFA Architects and Planners here in Toronto. How many people in here are service providers and or contractors? Anyone? Anyone? Oh, we got one. Okay. Facilities managers? Anybody over here? Okay. So that's interesting, because you guys maybe don't feel my pain so much, but one of the things that Ladislav and I had come together on in terms of forming Arkilio was to identify pain points in the construction industry and see how blockchain technology could be applied to solve some of these issues. As an architect, running a small, medium-sized company, about 20 employees, cash flow is an issue, and it's generally an issue because my clients don't pay me on time. So if you saw my receivables at the moment, you'd all cry. I cry every night about it. So it's something that's commonplace. It's commonplace on the consulting end of it. It's commonplace on the contractor end of it. So when you see our booth down, we're at 1200A, I think it is, on the floor. Come by and look. You'll see we have these nice little red signs with a line through it that says no more late payments. And that's basically what we're attempting to solve with Arkilio. So sort of backing up a bit here, construction matters. $9.5 trillion per year. It's a huge, huge industry. 13% of the world GDP. One thing, though, in terms of our industry that is problematic, we're at about 1% productivity growth, which is low compared to other industries for sure. One of the reasons why this is an issue is that we're very fragmented. Over 3 million small businesses around the world, sort of all contributing to that $9.5 trillion per year. In the United States and Canada, the industry is about 660 billion, and just as fragmented as it is in the global, on the global end of it. In terms of late payments and why late payments are a problem, basically, globally, you can start to see in this graph here that the days in which payments are sort of increasing from 62, 64 and a half, 67, 70 compared to other industries, and it's a problem that just keeps on getting worse in the construction industry. Accounts receivable in Canada, 62 days in 2008, 70 days in 2011. If you look at the UK, we're up at around 120 days. These are numbers that are very unacceptable for an industry, like the construction industry, that is such a big part of the economy. The impacts are numerous. It slows down the velocity of cash in the economy. I know that if I'm not paid on time, I push things off to the next year. It's a common business practice. That's taxable revenue that is pulled directly out of the public purse. Impacts on construction costs, employment and investment. In terms of construction costs, we will pad bids because we need to sort of make up some money that we know that we're going to end up using for financing our receivables because we don't get them paid on time. In terms of the cost for late payments, we've sort of done a bit of analysis here. In terms of the average firm, it's about 250 hours per year per firm. We sort of put that over the industry, and that costs approximately $20 billion a year. Now that's people generally like myself who run a company, where our time is generally more valuable in the company than the others that work for us, and that's time we spend chasing, going from client to client, basically asking them to pay, or having to maybe chase them in court, filing liens. These things are all costs to our business. In terms of back to the padding, 5 to 10% bid premiums where we anticipate risk. This is commonplace on both the contracting side as well as the consulting side. It's something that when you add it up at $35 billion a year, it's a huge premium that we're paying as an industry. In terms of the operating expenses, to be able to cover those costs, that again actually is increasing steadily from $73 in 2000 to $123, which adds up to about $22.5 billion per year. Now the causes, and this is something that is very complex. These are things that we've identified. The complexity in terms of one-off projects. The industry is fragmented in the sense that people will do these projects and keep a lot of the information to themselves. There seems to be in the industry sort of a reticence to sharing information. If the projects were more collaborative and there was more transparency in terms of performance, we would be in a much better position in terms of clients wanting to pay their bills and consultants and or contractors wanting to perform to get their bills paid. It seems that the way that the industry works largely is that we end up with this very fractious relationship between the consulting end of it as well as the contractors, with the client in the middle, basically leaving us in a situation where it's a bit of a power struggle, and clients a lot of the time don't trust that the service has been provided to the standard that it should have been provided. When that transparency and that trust is lost, then you get into a dispute. And the disputes over what's owed, they cost time. It's something where, if somebody doesn't believe that I'm 20% done my design development drawings, that's not necessarily an easy thing to prove. And if it's we're in a situation right off the bat that is a bit confrontational, the client's more apt to sort of sit there and hold the invoice than they are to pay it, and hopefully get more performance out of me by doing it. A lot of the time that can backfire because consultants and contractors will turn their attention to something where they feel that they're going to get paid sooner, and then that client suffers. There's incentives to pay late, and those incentives generally are leverage based. So if I'm in deep with somebody and they know it and they can get me deeper, then that just is incentive for them to keep going down that road. As smaller companies, especially when you're taking advantage of them in that scenario, they can dig themselves very deep, and it's chronic in the industry where people have basically been, businesses closed down, gone bankrupt because they can't actually, meet their obligations in terms of paying their employees, all because of late payment. In terms of solutions that are out there, there are things that are happening. Procurement frameworks, these are generally limited in scope, larger organizations, and don't sort of cover the whole industry, but can be effective in terms of their limited scope. Where you're seeing actually movement in Ontario in particular is through legislation. I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with Prompt Payment Ontario. They will be speaking tomorrow at the CEO breakfast. The lawyers that are involved with that, and it's basically an initiative in Ontario to put legislation forward that will help contractors and consultants in the industry. This is bureaucratic, it takes time, and the effectiveness is always questionable. The UK has tried this, I think it's over 10 times, right? Like maybe closer to 15 times, and with very, very limited success rates. So it's good that we're trying it here in Ontario. If you check out the Prompt Payment Ontario website, they have a really great list of supporters. Unfortunately, in terms of teeth, we're not really sure how far that will go. But you have basically unions, professional associations, everybody trying to get on board with this, which is great. But at the same point in time, we're not holding our breath in terms of the effectiveness. Escrow and supply chain finance or factoring. These are tools that exist today. They're just very expensive to do, and they don't help us with regard to time. With regard to escrow, you can set up an escrow account with a client. You have to hire a lawyer. You have to set up a separate bank account. There's costs involved with that, and it doesn't necessarily shorten the time in terms of which you're paid. Similar in terms of factoring. Factoring companies generally go after much larger payables in other industries like the trucking industry. They're not usually seeing the payables and the type of payables that we have in the construction industry as sort of something that they're that interested in going after. Although we're thinking that we'd like to change that. Payment management software, again, this is something for larger projects and generally fairly expensive. Something that works on more like kind of one-off type situations that can be effective, but is not really available to the majority of players in the marketplace. So, in terms of what Arkilio is doing, we would like to create a token economy really around building information, and what we look for in terms of the blockchain technology to bring to the table is the ability to take some of these things that I've just mentioned that work in real life, but not well, and they don't work in a way that's efficient. So when we look at smart contracts, we can actually do some of this stuff in a way that it actually works a lot faster and a lot better than you would do it in sort of an analog way. For example, escrow. Okay, so in the escrow scenario, if I'm the service provider and you guys are the client, you could potentially have a digital wallet. A smart contract could be written for an escrow account. You basically put some money up into the escrow account that's no longer in your control based on the contract. And then once I perform the services agreed to in the contract, the escrow, and you agree to that, the escrow account pays directly to me. No checks, and is done in a very timely manner, a matter of minutes as opposed to 30 days, which is the standard, which, as we know, is not actually what people adhere to. So
How does that make people pay faster? Because they have to approve it. Like there's still that.
they still have to approve it, yeah, and we'll sort of get to that in a moment. You know, escrow is a way in which to incentivize performance, right? So what we're starting to talk about is sort of the incentivization of performance to a certain extent on both sides of the equation. And this is where, you know, blockchain technology potentially gets very powerful, and the smart contracts that can be written to facilitate some of these functions that really what they do is they extract trust from the equation. So right now you have to, you know, if we're in a contract and I'm the service provider, you're the client, we rely on trust, right? If we take trust out of the equation, and that's something that escrow does, it basically, you know, you're putting the money up. If I perform and you say that I have performed, right, then the contract will pay out. So that there starts to actually remove trust from the equation, and that's what we're trying to do, is to try and get a trustless sort of scenario, which increases the transparency.
Put all the money up.
Well, this could work a whole bunch of different ways, right? You know, and you know, right now there's this questions of volatility in terms of a token like an ART token. If we were to launch it tomorrow, it would be very volatile. You would be, you know, exposing yourself, even with Bitcoin and other coins, you're exposing yourself to the volatility of the coin at the moment. But transferring, you know, between you know, fiat currencies and cryptocurrencies is something that's being worked on in terms of making that less of a risk. So you may prime an account in a fiat currency, right, and be able to transfer it. It's still, you know, an escrow account. So cascade payment is also like an interesting possibility with smart contracts. This is when, you know, as a contractor or as a prime consultant, I'll have subcontractors or subconsultants behind me. Now, as a client, you want to know that if you pay the prime, right, that everybody else is paid behind, because you don't want to call, you know, a month later where, you know, my structural engineer that I've hired, that's part of the consulting team, calls up the client and says, hey, where's my money? I'm going to lien your job. And you're like, well, I paid Kregg, and, you know, Kregg's a good guy, he didn't pay you? And the structural engineer is like, no, he didn't pay me, so he liens the job. So cascade of payment is something where you can link the smart contracts, and when the client pays the prime consultant, it goes through my wallet, and then it goes into the next people in line. So this is something that can go all the way down the line. And when you look at larger projects, especially on the general contracting side, where you could have 40, 50 you know, potential subcontractors there, this actually saves a ton of time. You know, it just saves the time in checks, right, and signing checks. Incentives to pay, you know, and this sort of gets to your point in terms of, like, you know, why is the client going to pay faster? You know, the escrow account is the client as a good person that's sort of sitting there saying, I'm going to put the money up, and they're trying to incentivize the service provider. Now, the service provider could incentivize the client as well. If I basically put in there, you know, I'm going to give you 5% or 10% in terms of a discount if you pay immediately, right? That becomes something that's hard for the client to sort of turn down. You look at some clients like the City of Toronto, who's one of my clients. They actually kind of do it backwards. They say, we will pay you within 30 days if you cut 2% out of your fee, which is brutal, but I mean, it is something that that happens. So by allowing the in an easy way, the consultant, the service provider, to basically send an invoice, and in that invoice, when the client sort of brings it up on the screen, that incentive is right there. It's hard for them to turn down, and you're trying to incentivize them to pay in a timely manner. Integrated factoring. This is where it starts to get pretty interesting. If you think about, you know, in the United States and Canada, a $660 billion business where the invoicing is paid on time, somewhere between 5 and 10% of the time. That leaves 90% of that chunk, right, out there as a bit of a market unto itself in terms of factoring. So one of the things that we're investigating with Arkilio is to create a factoring auction. So if my receivable is not going to come on time, and I know that, and that's something that the system can help facilitate, where I send an invoice to you. You know, maybe you're a developer. I work for a lot of developers. They don't want to pay with their own money, so they're always waiting for the bank, or they're waiting for some sort of financing. So they basically say, hey, Kregg, yeah, great job. You've done your schematic design. You've done your design development. And I'm like, can I have my check, please? And they're like, no. We're not going to be paid for another, you know, 2-3 months. Who knows? Whenever the bank gets around to it. And I just generally go off and, like, you know, keep doing work, right? Dig myself deeper in. That becomes a problem, obviously. So you know, if we get to a situation where, you know, we have this factoring auction, I could take that receivable and basically push it out to the factoring auction, and I take a cut, right? I take a bit of a haircut, and that could be, you know, whatever the market is sort of driving at, depending on the size of this factoring auction. And you know, I'm okay with, like, taking, you know, maybe you know, 1 month, you know, 4 or 5%, you know, maybe more in terms of what I need in terms of running my company and cash flow. Again, we're extracting trust from the equation, and it's no longer in the developer's hand to basically gain leverage over me. I can make that choice, right? You know, maybe I'll wait the 2 months or 3 months. It doesn't, you know, maybe I don't need that money. But if I do have to make payroll at the end of the month, and I don't have the ability to do this, then I have to go to the bank, or I have to do some other sort of financing. In terms of performance data, and what blockchain sort of allows us to do, is that you know, this is a very litigious, and those of you that aren't contractors, the majority of you, or consultants, you maybe don't tap into this too much. But you know, when I sat down at the initial OAA, which is the Ontario Association of Architects, welcome to becoming an architect kind of class that they have. They march in the insurers, and the insurers basically sit there and say, look at the person to the right and look at the person to the left. Within 3 years, 2 of you will be sued once you have your license and you're practicing. Which is a bit scary, right? And that's in Canada. Never mind what happens in the States. So when you look at the blockchain and the blockchain technology and what it allows for us to do in terms of recording transactions married with intellectual property that we're creating, we can actually send an invoice to the client. The client opens it. It has the digital IP there, which is our deliverable, right? Once they approve it, or if they've opened it and they've reviewed it, it's written to the blockchain, right? In terms of putting this into an immutable ledger that then down the road can actually be brought into a legal context. Now, that is something that at the moment, you know, blockchain in law is still in its beginning stages, but it is something that gives you a snapshot of what that job is over time, especially if it goes the length of the job. One of the things in court, if you've ever been to court, you're always trying to reconstruct the past. And lawyers, you know, are paid on how well they can reconstruct the past. And they'll inevitably tell you that the past that they construct sometimes is not the past that happened, more than often not. This starts to provide a pretty interesting milestone framework that marries the IP that you're actually creating with the payments, and it's an agreement between two parties, which then becomes a pretty nice story in a court of law. So one of the things that we're working towards with Arkilio is an art token, which would be part of our ICO. And you know, there's things that we can actually do with this in terms of kind of next stage incentivization, where potentially the platform itself could reward people for timely payment. And you could actually start to build a profile as either a service provider, contractor, consultant, and or even a client in terms of how well you pay, right? If you're a client that's putting money in escrow and you're really trying to incentivize your service provider, I know as a service provider that's the person that I want to work for, right? The other clients who maybe I'm doing the same sort of product for that aren't going to pay me in that way, and I know I'm going to be chasing, I'm not going to put as much effort into trying to get their dollars as I am the dollar that's already sitting there in front of me. And these sorts of this sort of behavior can then be put into metrics that we can start to see who are the good clients, who are the good service providers, who are these people that you want to work with and sort of facilitate these good relationships, and start to take away that sort of confrontational aspect of the industry, and really start to build something that is a little bit more of a positive, has a positive vibe in terms of moving forward on projects. In terms of cascade of payments, we talked about that already. In terms of compensation from the platform, I think I'll let Lad touch on that if we get to that. And I think that what we'll do now is get into a bit of a Q&A where we can sort of stimulate a bit of a discussion about blockchain technology, crypto, and potentially Arkilio if you guys want to know more about what we're doing. Again, I encourage you to come down and speak with us on the floor. And if any of you have sort of any interest in sort of helping us out down the road, we are looking for people that want to work with us in terms of creating positive relationships and moving this project forward. So do we have any questions? Oh, actually, and one thing just before we get into that, in case I forget, we have Bernie Doyle here. Bernie's from Government Blockchain Canada, of which Arkilio's a member. So if there is any questions with regard to how this is working towards blockchain in the government, Bernie's here to facilitate the questions as well. Okay? Any questions to start off? Yep. We'll go with you first. Yeah, like even in our minimal viable product, basically what we're doing is, if I was to send you an invoice, then I would actually have what I've created attached to it. As an architect, I can basically PDF those drawings, and you basically open them up, you look at it, you see that yes, Kregg, you're done schematic design, and approve. And then that basically is recorded with the transaction to the blockchain and saved in a database. And then those can be married up down the road if you end up in court, right? Yeah. It's basically in terms of auditability of performance, it gives you that ability, which is quite powerful when you think about it. I mean, it's sort of. It seems subtle, but when we have intellectual property and it's being, shared over the internet, these types of things allow for it to be like registered mail, right? Where you can actually go back and say legitimately, yes, we agreed on this at that point in time, and this is what we agreed on.
I just wanted to add to that an important point that what is actually stored on the blockchain is a hash of the information that has been submitted. And I don't know how many of you know the concept of hash. It's basically a number or set of characters that you can generate based on the content. And the content can actually include documents, can include text, content of the emails. So this way you can actually effectively create a unique signature that only that transaction that has been submitted together with all the documentation can create. So in effect, you're actually securing not just the information about the payment itself, but also all the documents that have been submitted as a deliverable that have been approved by you. So if later I, for example, try to change the drawing even a little bit, it would never provide or generate the same signature. So this is something which actually we sort of quoted sort of court of law as the most likely area where this would be helpful. Mark from Infrastructure Ontario, who is here, have actually brought another use case to us, which was quite interesting, which is you work for a government, you manage a lot of projects, and you do need to worry about the performance of these projects. You get audited. So again, you need to have access to information in a way that can be trusted and cannot be augmented later.
Any other questions? Okay, we're going to hang around for a bit if anybody wants to come up and talk. But thank you very much for coming out today.